Back inside. It was the manner of this nobleman's approach that started the trouble. Completely unaware of the arrival of the real people of Glastonbury upon the field, my lord had taken it into his head to have himself driven by Sergeant Blimp in a light dog-cart over from Mark Court. Taking for granted that his daughter was keeping a seat for him, as indeed she had written to say she would do, Lord P. told Blimp to drive him straight round the field. They entered it from a gate at the town end, till he reached the front row of seats and there drop him. "You can go," he had said, "to the Pilgrim's Den, Blimp, and put up. I'll walk round there later." Now, Sergeant Blimp, although he would have submitted to torture rather than have slept in Merlin's room, had no fear of a mob. So when it became obvious that there was a mob, and a rather dangerous-looking one between them and their objective, the sergeant cracked his whip and trotted his tall black horse all the more resolutely. Then the disturbance, which had been on the edge of breaking out for so long, really did seem inevitable. Hundreds of angry voices were raised. People who were further off pushed others who were nearer, right into the path of the dog-cart. Sticks were brandished, and if stones were not thrown, it was rather due to the fact that there were none in the grassy field than to any want of a will to throw them. Lord P., though courted by the Wessex bourgeoisie, was, for certain particular reasons, detested by its proletariat. And his appearance at this juncture gave this latter a chance that was not likely to be repeated. In all human communities, indeed in all human groups, there are strange atavistic forces that are held in chains deep down under the surface. Like the imprisoned titans, these Enceladusins and Siphyses and Briaruses, Enceladus, I don't know what that refers to. Enceladus. Maybe one of our long-time listeners can look that up and tell me what it means. And then Briareus, Briareuses, Sisyphus, I'm familiar with. Anyway, they dwell in the nether depths of human nature, ready to break forth in blind scoriac fury under a given touch. In these violent upheavals of class against class, there is something far deeper than principle or opinion at stake. Skin against skin, blood against blood, nerves against nerves, rises up from incalculable depths. Lord P. himself is not less than astounded at the intensity of the feeling that his figures in this dog-cart by the side of his placid servant excited in this mob. It was as if everything in these people's lives that they had suffered from indifference, neglect, contempt, cold, malignant distaste, fastidious disgust, everything that had weighed on them, day by day, in a tacit conspiracy to press them down and keep them down, suddenly incarnated itself in that grizzled man with a small pointed gray beard and big wrinkled nose. Lord P. was absolutely startled, and, though by no means a coward, he was even a little frightened by the looks he caught on some of the women's faces in that surging mass of people. Oh yeah, I forgot, this is our 100th episode, so congrats for that, I guess. Living 100 days. Anyway. While his black horse plunged and reared in its harness, while men tugged at its bridle and tried to pull the reins out of Blimp's hands, while there were danger not only of the shafts of the cart being broken, but of the whole equipage being upset, he caught on the face of one woman from Paradise. She was a remote cousin, by the way, of Abel Twig. A look of such insane ferocity, free from every other feeling, that a spasm of sheer panic seized upon him. It was one of those moments that are apt to occur in the most carefully regulated communities. My lord was no longer under the protection of an invisible network of magnetic wires. He was a man and a man acquainted with fear. But what had frightened him was not the violence of other men. What had frightened him was a glance into a black crater. For that black crater possessed eyes, and the Marquis of P, clinging to his swaying and heaving dog-cart, had looked into those eyes. People rarely receive these revelations of the underside of life unaccompanied by some funny little triviality which, like a mime or a moment, goes ever afterwards hand in hand with that chimera. The trivial thing on this occasion was some black horsehairs which lay smeared in a little patch against one of the green shafts now in such imminent danger of being broken. Black horsehairs, wet with sweat and sticking to painted wood, were henceforth always associated in his mind with his deadly popular fury surging up out of the cracks and crevices of Tor Field. It was impossible for the Taunton police to remain long in ignorance of the nature of this howling and struggling group of persons who were apparently hustling two men in a painted cart and trying to pull them out. But for the next 3 or 4 minutes, their official attention was so completely occupied in holding back the crowd which kept pouring down the lane from entering the field that they could not cope with this new trouble. "Even a Somerset officer," as one of them said to Lord P on a subsequent occasion, "couldn't be in 2 corners of the same girt field in the same time." It was, however, much easier for Mr. Girard, who was, quite simply, as he had told his family he would be, surveying matters from the top of the Tor, to get the full significance of the danger to Lord P, than it was for Taunton policemen. They were forced to look up, being fully occupied. He was in a position to look down, having nothing to do. There certainly would have been a rush from the bourgeoisie portion of the native audience to rescue this hustled nobleman. In fact, his own son, Will Zoyland, would have been at his side in a couple of minutes, if it had not been for 2 things. First, that there was a rise in the ground to the west of that audience, which prevented them from seeing what was transpiring over there, and secondly, that the long-expected pageant now commenced in real earnest, absorbing everyone's attention. A couple of 100 lads and lasses, gorgeously attired in medieval costume, marched forth now from the 2 heraldic pavilions and grouped themselves round the dragon flag and round the 2 golden thrones. The body of the dead Elaine was carried in. Never in her life had Crummie looked so lovely. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, accompanied by a knight carrying the crown of Britain on a green cushion, stood at the feet of the dead. Lancelot du Lac leaned against the side of Queen Guinevere's throne, while, for those initiated in such matters, the form of Sir Percival, Sir Galahad, and Sir Gawain, clearly distinguishable from one another by the devices of their shields, could be made out conversing together at the back of Arthur's throne. To the west of the Queen's throne, and at a little distance from the rest, as if retaining their own mythical independence, stood Tristram and Iseult, while Iseult, I forget how to pronounce her name, while in a position of ferocious skulking, spying, and murderously tracking down was King Mark of Cornwall. In regard to the choice of characters for this first part of the pageant, there had been no difficulty save for one curious exception. This exception was Merlin. John had been very anxious to have Merlin, and so had Edward Atling. Mr. Girard, however, had steadily and, to the mind of the whole company, obstinately, refused to allow Merlin to be represented at all. "But we're going to represent Christ, Daddy," Crummie had pleaded. "You don't mean to say that Merlin's more sacred than Christ?" Mr. Girard had smiled and shook his head. "Christ was buried in Jerusalem," was his curious answer, by which John understood him to mean that while for the world at large Christ was by far the most sacred, here, in Glastonbury, where he disappeared from view, Merlin must always be the numen, or the tremendum mysterium, that can be second to none. Wow. Mr. Girard had reached the top of the hill by a circuitous route long before the pageant was due to begin. The performance was divided. and the Dubliners had displayed their nicest virtuosity in the way this had been done into 3 parts. All 3 parts had a lot of dumb show, a limited amount of dialogue, and a great many choral songs. But the point in which the high technical skill of the Dubliners was the most revealed was in the manner in which the pageant was fused and blended with the Passion play, the two together forming a trilogy to which a strange and original unity had been given by the rôle played by Arthur's Fool. The Dubliners, with the Irish audacity, had given Cowper the leading role of all 3 parts, and by an artful reversal of chronology in the interest of symbolism, the thing began with the latest epoch of time and worked back to the earliest. Thus, the opening dealt with the Arthurian cycle, the interlude with the Passion of Christ, and the conclusion with the ancient Cymric mythology, Cowper being Dragonet in the first, Momus, a comic Roman soldier in the second, and none other than the bard Taliesin in the third. In the intervals of these violent quarrels with Atling, the Dubliners had worked very enthusiastically with him over these mystical effects. Atling had indulged himself with the passionate wistfulness of the kind of poetry he had made up his mind to forsake, but the new note, the modern note, that was so obnoxious to Lady Rochelle, had forced its way in, and had given a bizarre and even an uncomfortable twist to many scenes of the strange pageant. This was especially the case with the scenes in which Cowper entered, and the great clown consenting to use several poignant and mocking apothegms composed by the Middlezoy poet, had added to them certain curious touches of his own. There was such a distance between the grassy ledge where the performance took place and the front row of seats that the voices of individual players were liable to be blown away upon the wind. This was, however, compensated far by a printed libretto which the audience could read while they enjoyed the dancing, the studied gestures, the symbolic ritual of the trilogy. Mr. Garrett had many deep and strange feelings as he watched this gathering crowd from the top of the tour. He had found quite a large group of noisy lads up there when he reached the top, but, knowing the mayor by sight, they had hurriedly shogged off, running down the hill at top speed to join in the sport of baiting the policemen where the booths and caravans stood in a line under the hedge and where ginger pop was to be sold. All except one. This was the small offspring of Solly Lou, the taxi driver, a grave little boy called Steve, who had manifested for Mr. Garrett the moment he appeared the peculiar fascination that a child will sometimes display for a formidable middle-aged man. Mr. Garrett, finding himself alone with this child on the summit of the great haunted hill, the hill of Gwynap Nod, the Welsh fairy demon, the hill where Abbot Whitling had been so bloodily murdered, called Steve to his side and made him sit down with him under the tower. It was indeed upon a remarkable scene that Mr. Garrett and his small companion looked down now as they surveyed the vendorous undulations of those island valleys. Yins Wurtrin, Yins Avaloch, Insula Avalonia, the land of Mordred, Meloas, Melignant, Meligrants, Astiva Regio, Insula Pomorum, Gualdirhav, Insula Vitria, Isle de Vore, Ir Yidchwood, Galast, Glastonic, Glastonia, Galaston, over which the intense sky that midsummer day seemed actually to be bowing down, bowing and bending and battening upon these lovely green undulations, as if the greatest and most powerful of all created beings was taking his pleasure with the sweet grass-scented earth. The crowd of people, seated on their chairs and benches in the center of the bottom of the field, resembled a magician's carpet that Mr. Garrett, by his incantations from up there under St. Michael's Tower, had caused to be laid down. He himself now, like a modern Gwynap Nud, surveyed his astonishing evocation with a silent gratitude, with an upwelling feeling of fulfillment, deep as that fount of red water whose flowing he could detect at the foot of the opposite hill. The hats and garments and parasols of the feminine element of his audience, for they were all dressed for summer weather that day, caused the great expectant crowd to resemble, spread out upon the grass, that many-colored coat which the original nomadic Joseph had received out of his father Jacob. Westward of the crowd, Mr. Garrett could see the roofs of Glastonbury looking, with all their bright red tiles, as if a great wave of spray from the chalybeate fountain had washed over them. Rising from above these red-tiled roofs, he could see the massive tower of St. John's and the lesser tower of St. Benignus. Whew! Well, we'll stop there for today. That's episode number 100. I wish I had some balloons or one of those kazoo things. What do they call those things? You know, the... What are those? I can't think of what those are called. But I have nothing. I have nothing for you. No celebration. Maybe in the 150th episode, because we'll probably have that. I'm pretty certain. Maybe I'll have something for that. But until next time, hang in there. And I'll see you in Glastonbury. Bye.